In 490 BC, a scary sight appeared on the shores of Attica, the largest army the world had ever seen. A huge Persian force landed at Marathon, ready to crush the young democracy of Athens. This wasn't just about land or resources. It was about an idea, a way of life that was barely a generation old. Outnumbered by what felt like an impossible amount, more than 2 to 1, the Greeks knew they had just one chance. One desperate high-stakes chance to save their independent city-states, their precious freedom, and perhaps most importantly, the very seeds of what we now treasure as Western civilization. They weren't going to win with sheer numbers. That was never an option. Instead, they won with a crazy, almost suicidal, high-risk idea that completely flipped the rules of ancient warfare on their head. So, how did this mixed team of citizen soldiers, farmers, and craftsmen in bronze manage to crush the mighty Persian superpower in a single morning? What began as a desperate gamble would soon become legend, the battle that changed history. Let's rewind a bit. The Ionian revolt a few years earlier had been a complete failure. Those Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor, unhappy under Persian rule, had dared to rise up, and Athens and Eretria had foolishly sent a handful of ships to help their Ionian cousins fight against Persia. Emperor Darius I, the absolute ruler of a vast empire stretching from India to Egypt, was definitely not the forgive and forget type. He was a man who remembered insults, and he vowed to remember the Athenians for their boldness. By 491 BC, Persian heralds, those scary messengers, were already making their rounds, demanding earth and water, the traditional chilling symbols of surrender from every island and city-state in the Aegean. Most understandably gave in. Who wouldn't when faced with such overwhelming power? But not Athens, and certainly not Sparta. Those proud cities famously threw the messengers into pits and wells, a defiant act that made war not just likely, but an absolute guarantee. By midsummer 490 BC, the promise of war became a terrifying reality. 600 triremes, sleek, fast Persian battleships, powered by hundreds of oarsmen, many of them Phoenicians, Egyptians, and even subject Greeks, carried roughly 25,000 infantry and cavalry across the shimmering Aegean Sea. Among them was Hippias, the former tyrant of Athens, a bitter exile who rode along as a guide, whispering promises to the Persians that they'd be welcomed as liberators by a grateful population. The fleet, an unstoppable tide, swept down the coast, reconquering islands that had dared to waver in their loyalty. After a quick, brutal siege, they burnt Eretria, Athens's ally, to the ground. That destruction served as a chilling, smoky warning. Athens was next on their shopping list, a prize ripe for the taking. The Persians then beached their ships in the broad marshy crescent of Marathon Bay, a spot about 26 kilometers northeast of Athens. This location wasn't accidental. The flat plain was absolutely perfect for their powerful cavalry, allowing them to move around and deploy with ease. The bay itself offered a deep harbor where ships could bring in supplies for weeks, if not months. Everything about this landing, from the sheer size of the force to the choice of terrain, screamed one thing: we're here for the long haul, we're here to stay, and we're here to conquer. Athens had to respond, and fast, or face total destruction. Inside the city of Athens, the mood was, as you might imagine, pure panic. The 10 elected generals, the strategoi, each a leader in their own right, argued fiercely over what to do. The options seemed equally terrible, each filled with unimaginable danger. They could hide behind their wooden walls, hoping the Spartans, their powerful allies, would arrive in time to save them. But how long could they hold out against such a massive force? Or they could march out, meet the Persians in open battle on the plain, and almost certainly die, their city left defenseless. The third option, a desperate, bold gamble on a completely new kind of battle, a tactic that went against all traditional wisdom. The deciding voice, the one that cut through the fear and confusion, belonged to Miltiades. He was a battle-scarred veteran of earlier Persian campaigns, a man who knew their ways, their strengths, and crucially their weaknesses. He had only recently returned from the northern Aegean, bringing with him invaluable experience. He knew Persian strategy intimately. Their plan was to weaken the enemy with overwhelming clouds of arrows, then send in their powerful cavalry to break the shaken lines. Miltiades' plan, simple yet revolutionary. Don't let that plan play out. Don't let them control the terms. Even before the main force moved, one Athenian, a legendary runner named Phidippides, had already begun an epic sprint. he covered the staggering 240 kilometers to Sparta in just 2 days, begging for help. The Spartans, while sympathetic, were bound by strict religious tradition. They couldn't march until the full moon. Athens, however, couldn't wait for any celestial calendar. Their very existence hung in the balance. So, they gathered every able-bodied man, citizens from 18 to 60, about 9,000 heavily armored hoplites clad in gleaming bronze, and they weren't alone. The Plataeans, tiny but fiercely loyal Boeotian allies, sent a full 1,000 more of their own, proof of their courage and commitment. In total, the Greek force numbered roughly 10,000 heavy infantry, 0 cavalry, no archers of their own, a small, compact force against an empire. They marched out at dawn, covering the 26 kilometers to Marathon, arriving at the foothills overlooking the plain just as the morning sun began to light the countless Persian campfires below. The sight must have been both inspiring and utterly terrifying. A Greek hoplite wasn't just a soldier, he was a walking fortress. He wore a bowl-shaped bronze helmet, often decorated with a crest that left only his eyes and mouth visible, offering incredible protection but limiting side vision. Strapped to his left arm was a massive 30-pound shield, the hoplon, from which the hoplite got his name. This wasn't just any shield. It was a disc-shaped masterpiece of wood and bronze, 3 feet wide, designed not just for individual defense, but as part of a collective wall. His torso was protected by a cuirass either of layered linen, linothorax, or solid bronze molded to his form. Greaves covered his shins, and in his hands he wielded a 2.5-meter-long spear perfect for thrusting, backed up by a shorter iron sword for close-quarters fighting. The key to the hoplite wasn't just his individual equipment, but how he fought, shoulder to shoulder, shield overlapping his neighbors, forming an almost impenetrable, bristling porcupine wall that could punch forward like a human sledgehammer. This was the phalanx, a formation built on unity, discipline, and sheer physical force. Now let's contrast that with the Persian infantry, particularly the sperabara or shield-bearers, who formed the front line. They carried large rectangular wicker shields which were light and good for deflecting arrows but offered little resistance against a bronze-tipped spear thrust. Their armor was typically light cloth or leather, a stark contrast to the Greeks' heavy bronze. Their primary weapons were shorter spears, and they carried quivers of arrows for skirmishing. Behind these frontline troops came the true power of the Persian ranged attack, the Median and Persian archers. These were highly skilled bowmen, unleashing volleys from powerful composite bows with 60-pound draw weights capable of raining down death from a distance. And then there was the Persian cavalry, priceless on open plains. These mounted archers and lancers wore scale cuirasses and could pepper an enemy with arrows from horseback or charge down a broken formation. In a straight-up head-to-head shove, the Greeks with their heavy armor and tight formation were like tanks. The Persians, with their mobility and ranged weapons, were more like jeeps with machine guns. The problem, as Miltiades knew all too well, was that those jeeps could shoot you full of holes long before your tanks ever got close enough to fight. For 8 long, agonizing days, the two armies eyeballed each other across 4 kilometers of flat grass on the plain of Marathon. The Greeks held the high ground, positioned on the slopes overlooking the plain, a defensive advantage that prevented the Persian cavalry from easily outflanking them. The Persians, meanwhile, camped comfortably near the beach, their supply lines secure, their fleet ever present. Neither side rushed into battle. It was a tense, silent standoff, a war of nerves. Miltiades, the Athenian general, was playing a dangerous waiting game. He was keenly aware of the devastating power of the Persian cavalry, and he absolutely refused to risk battle while they were a threat. Some historical sources even suggest that the Persian horses might have been loaded back onto ships for a period, perhaps to be watered elsewhere, or to be moved for a flanking maneuver around Cape Suez. This potential absence was a critical factor in Miltiades' calculations. Meanwhile, Athenian morale swung wildly between the gnawing fear of being outflanked, surrounded, and massacred, and an eager, almost desperate desire to just get it over with, to meet the enemy and decide their fate. Inside the fancy Persian command tent, Datis the Mede and Artapernes the Persian noble, commanders of this vast invasion force, made a crucial fatal mistake. They believed the Greeks would stay put on their high ground, perhaps engage in some minor skirmishes, but surely never dare to charge a numerically superior force. Such a move would be madness by their strategic understanding. Their cunning plan was to exploit this perceived Greek timidity. They intended to load a significant portion of their cavalry back onto the ships, sail them around Cape Sunion, the southern tip of Attica, and then drop them directly into Athens' undefended harbor. While the main Greek infantry was stuck at Marathon, expecting a direct attack, the cavalry would seize the city from behind. It was a classic misdirection, a brilliant strategic move designed to bypass the Greek defenses. What they never ever imagined was that the Greeks, against all military logic, would abandon their advantageous high ground and sprint downhill first, stopping their entire plan. That pride, that underestimation of Greek boldness would cost them dearly. Then came the ninth dawn. As the first rays of light touched the plain, scouts, their faces grim, reported something strange to Miltiades and the other generals. Fewer campfires flickering in the Persian camp, and more significantly fewer neighing horses. The Persian cavalry, that terrifying arm of their force, appeared to be gone, or at least significantly reduced. This was the moment Miltiades had been waiting for, the window of opportunity he'd gambled everything on. He quickly called together the generals. "If we wait," he argued, his voice urgent, "they will outflank us, sail to Athens, and we will be caught between two forces. If we charge now, we fight on our terms, not theirs." His gamble was truly astonishing, a stroke of tactical genius that went against centuries of military tradition. Instead of the standard strong 80 line that Greek phalanxes typically formed, Miltiades ordered a radical change. Pack the wings to a depth of 8, or even more, while thinning the center perhaps to only 3, or even just 2 men deep. It was completely counterintuitive, wasn't it? Every instinct screamed to reinforce the center, the most vulnerable part of the line. But Miltiades had a brilliant, almost strange idea. He knew the Persian best troops, their elite, would naturally move towards the center of the battle. His plan was to let them punch through that deliberately weakened middle, creating a gap, while the Persian center surged forward, thinking they had broken the Greek line. The massively reinforced Greek wings would curl inward like powerful pincers, surrounding the enemy from both sides. It was a classic double envelopment, a maneuver that would be studied for thousands of years. Except no one had ever successfully tried it against a force as massive and powerful as the Persian army before. And there was one more twist, one final bold move. Once the Greek line formed up, they would advance at a steady walking pace, maintaining their perfect formation. But then, and this was the truly insane part, at about 200 meters out, they would break into a dead flat-out run, a full sprint in 30 pounds of bronze armor across uneven ground. That last furious dash served a critical purpose. It would drastically minimize their exposure to the devastating Persian arrow volleys, giving the archers less time to shoot their arrows and reload. More importantly, it would smash the phalanx into the enemy shield wall with incredible momentum before the archers could get off a second, more accurate volley. It was high risk, no doubt about it. If the Persian cavalry had still been ashore, those horses would have ridden down the Greek flanks, and the entire plan would have collapsed into a bloody disaster. But if the horses were indeed gone, well, as the old saying goes, fortune truly favors the bold, and Miltiades was betting everything on that fortune. The moment arrived. Trumpets blared across the plain, their sharp metallic calls echoing the tension. 10,000 bronze helmets glinting in the morning sun, bobbed in rhythmic unison as the Greek hoplites began their descent down the slope. From the Persian trenches, archers, initially surprised, quickly nocked their arrows, preparing for the usual slow, methodical crawl of an approaching enemy. What they got instead was an impossible, terrifying sprint. Clouds of arrows hissed skyward, a deadly dark rain. But in that desperate dash, most clattered harmlessly off the thick bronze shields and helmets, deflected by the speed and the sheer momentum of the charge. In less than 3 minutes, an astonishingly short time, the hoplites crashed into the Persian shield wall. It was a thunderous impact, spears punching through flimsy wicker, a collective roar erupting from the Greek lines as they pushed forward, a wall of bronze and fury. At first it looked like Persian numbers, and their elite troops might still win the day. The Greek center, deliberately thinned, buckled under the immense pressure. The hoplites there backpedaled, shields locked, giving ground slowly but crucially. They were not breaking. Their discipline, forged in the crucible of their city-states, held firm. This was all part of Miltiades' genius. While the center enacted its controlled retreat, the massively reinforced Greek wings, like two unstoppable juggernauts, smashed into the lighter Persian infantry on their flanks. Once those wings had decisively broken their immediate opponents, they executed a perfectly timed, pre-planned maneuver. They pivoted inward, turning from the flanks to slam into the sides and rear of the now exposed Persian center. Picture it like a monstrous nutcracker. The famous Persian corps, thinking they had achieved a breakthrough, surged forward into the gap created by the retreating Greek center. Then, with terrifying precision, the jaws of that nutcracker snapped shut. Surrounded on three sides, their formation shattered. The famous Persian immortals and other elite units panicked. Wicker shields splintered, spears snapped. The Greeks kept pushing, their coordinated effort relentless, until the entire Persian line, caught in this deadly embrace, unraveled completely, dissolving into chaos and fleeing desperately towards the beach. The battle itself lasted maybe 2 hours, short, brutal, and completely decisive. The plain of Marathon, once a peaceful expanse, was now a scene of horrific carnage. Persian dead littered 6 square kilometers. Ancient counts, though perhaps exaggerated, claim a staggering 6,400 lives lost. Greek losses by stark contrast were unbelievably light. A mere 192 Athenians and 11 brave Plataeans. Datis, the Persian commander, scrambled to salvage what he could, desperately herding the terrified survivors onto his waiting ships. The Greeks, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce desire for revenge, grabbed the mooring ropes, straining with all their might to haul the vessels ashore. Desperate to prevent the fleet from escaping, they managed to capture only 7 triremes in the chaotic fight. The rest, with oars flashing furiously, pulled away from the shore. Their retreat, a desperate, uncoordinated scramble. But the drama wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Persian admirals, having regrouped slightly, still clung to the hope that Athens itself might be undefended, a prize waiting to be taken. They hoisted sail and crept south along the coast, planning to seize the city under the empty Acropolis, believing the Greek army was still exhausted and trapped at Marathon. Miltiades, with an almost uncanny foresight, guessed their intentions perfectly. He immediately ordered his army, exhausted, armor soaked with sweat and blood from the recent savage fight, to march back to Athens at a forced, relentless pace. It was another incredible feat of endurance. They covered those same 26 kilometers in full equipment, pushing through their pain, descending from Mount Pentelicon, just as the first Persian masts appeared in Phaleron Bay, visible in the distance. Seeing the hoplites standing grim and ready, manning the walls of their city, Datis finally weighed the risk. The element of surprise was gone. His invasion had failed. With a heavy heart, he turned the fleet and vanished towards Asia. So, let's break it down, shall we? Why did this impossible victory happen? It wasn't just one thing, but a perfect storm of factors, brilliantly orchestrated. First, superior armor. Bronze beats wicker. Plain and simple. The Greek hoplites' heavy protection meant they could absorb hits that would fell a lightly armored Persian soldier, allowing them to close the distance and inflict devastating damage in close combat. Second, superior discipline and motivation. These weren't conscripts whipped into line. These were citizen soldiers who owned the land they fought for, who had a direct stake in their city's democracy and freedom. They fought harder with a unity and determination that a scattered imperial army simply couldn't match. Third, terrain choice. The marshy, uneven plain of Marathon, cleverly chosen by the Greeks, severely limited the ability of the powerful Persian cavalry, effectively neutralizing their greatest strength. Fourth, speed. That bold, unprecedented run negated the Persian archer advantage, denying them the time to unleash their full destructive volleys. The Greeks were on them before they could reload, turning a ranged battle into a brutal close-quarters fight, where Greek strength excelled. Fifth, and perhaps most crucially, leadership. He turned a potential massacre into a chess match, outthinking and outmaneuvering an empire. His tactical innovation, the thinned center, the strengthened wings, the charge was revolutionary. And finally, morale. The Greeks fought for their homes, for their nascent assembly, for their newly created democracy. They understood the stakes. The Persians, by contrast, largely fought because a great king told them to, for the glory of an empire that often felt distant. When push came to shove, heart counts, and the Greeks had it in spades. The victory at Marathon did more than just save a single city-state from conquest. It proved definitively that disciplined heavy infantry fighting with purpose could crush the world's biggest, fat, most feared empire. Greek warfare changed dramatically from scattered skirmishes to focused shock tactics. City-states across Greece poured wealth into hoplite training, developing wider phalanxes and even longer spears, refining the winning formula. Persian prestige, once unshakable, cracked. Subject provinces across their vast domain began to whisper of revolt, seeing that the mighty had feet of clay. A generation later, Xerxes, Darius's son, would try again, bringing an even larger force to Greece, leading to legendary stands at Thermopylae, the naval brilliance of Salamis, and the final land battle at Plataea. But Marathon had already shown the world that the myth of Persian invincibility was just that, a myth. The impossible had been achieved. To put this in modern perspective, imagine a small country with a highly trained volunteer army standing up and decisively defeating a massive superpower equipped with superior technology and overwhelming numbers. It's a story about cleverness, determination, and fighting for core values against overwhelming odds. The timeless story of underdogs winning the day. Now, about that iconic image of the lone runner. It's a powerful one, isn't it? But here's a little historical detail for you. Herodotus, our primary source for the Persian Wars, never actually mentions a lone courier sprinting to Athens with news of the victory, only to collapse and die on the Acropolis. What Herodotus records is Pheidippides' earlier run from Athens to Sparta to seek help. That incredibly romantic, dramatic twist of a death run from Marathon to Athens comes up much later, centuries after the fact in the writings of Plutarch and others. Still, whether historically accurate or a later addition, the spirit of that story endures. Modern marathons, those grueling 26.2-mile races, trace their very name and spirit to this day, commemorating that epic dash. Imagine the sheer adrenaline, the exhaustion, shields stacked, the graves of their fallen comrades still warm, and then a breathless herald, possibly Pheidippides himself, shouting, "Rejoice, we conquer." Whether fact or fable, the image stuck, a testament to the power of a story. Proof that words, when charged with such meaning, can travel farther and inspire more deeply than any arrow. Persia, of course, would lick its wounds, but Marathon had lit a fuse that would explode into a century of conflict and transformation. Athens, emboldened by its impossible victory and the newfound confidence in its citizen army, didn't just sit back. It began to build a formidable navy, forming the Delian League, which over time would transform into an Athenian empire. The drama, the philosophy, the architecture, all the foundational stuff we now proudly file under Western civilization got the crucial breathing room they needed to flourish, precisely because a few thousand farmers in bronze armor stood their ground one September morning. The very concept of civic participation and the value of individual freedom were underscored by this epic defense. Not bad for a plan reportedly sketched out in the dirt of a battlefield, was it? So that's the Battle of Marathon, a story that shows us brains, discipline, and a little bit of bold, calculated risk can truly topple overwhelming odds. 10,000. Greeks stared down an empire that dwarfed them in every conceivable way, bet everything on a desperate sprint, and in doing so completely reshaped the course of history. Next time you lace up your shoes for a jog, or step into a voting booth to cast your ballot in an election, take a moment to remember you're living in the deep, lasting ripples of that crazy, courageous sprint across a marshy plain in 490 BC. The fight for freedom, it turns out, can start with a single impossible charge.